All right, we'll get started in just a few minutes while we wait for others to join. Please take this final opportunity to respond to the poll on your screen. Um, I guess I will just repeat it one more time for anyone who's recently joined. You can participate in the poll by scanning that QR code that you see there, or going to slido.com and entering the code RCS. This poll really helps us to understand who's in the room and what perspectives we have here today in this conversation. And we'll give about one more minute for those joining to complete the poll, and then I'll pass it off to Alicia to get us started.
Great, and I'll come back to the results here in just a bit. But welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are members of the team behind the Building Resilience of Data Repositories During Periods of Crisis project, which was funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Today's webinar is focused on the project, including what we did, what we learned, and how the Repository Crisis Scorecards, or RCS, can be used as a tool to support reflection and planning around repository resilience. All the slides that we're going to be sharing today have been uploaded to Zenodo, and so I am going to share the link there in case you would like to access them at another time. But we are really glad to have a mix of people in the room. As you see, we have some funders, administrators, researchers, data users. But this project was designed to gather perspectives from people who manage repositories, contribute to them, use them, support research infrastructure, and care about the long-term availability of scientific and community data. So it's really good to have you all represented at this webinar as well. So by the end of today's session, you should have a better understanding of what this project explored, what we did, and who contributed to the work. We're then going to share some key findings from the project, especially what we learned about data disruption, repository resilience, and how disruptions can cascade across funding, staffing, infrastructure access, and trust. After that, we will introduce the Repository Crisis Scorecards, which we'll refer to as the RCS, and demonstrate how the tool can support reflection, planning, and prioritization. We will then move from finding to action by discussing practical steps that different people can take. Then we'll have a couple of pauses for questions and some polls throughout. So let's get started by sharing a little bit about the project, and I'm going to transfer it over to Talisha.
All right, thanks, Alicia. So repositories play an essential role in helping communities preserve, access, and use data over time. They support research, weather prediction, emergency response, public policy, the preservation of community memory, and other forms of evidence-based decision-making. But access to that data is not always guaranteed. Repositories can be disrupted by sudden events, such as natural disasters or technical failures. Other types of disruption may build over time, like funding instability, staffing loss, political pressure, or shifts in institutional priorities. When disruption happens, the effects can reach far beyond the repository itself. Systems become unavailable, data may be lost or just inaccessible, and we have been seeing this happening more and more over the last few years. So moving into why this project, what happens when researchers, policymakers, or the public community can no longer access the data they rely on? What decisions become harder to make? What knowledge becomes harder to preserve? So this project was launched in response to growing concern about the resilience of data repositories and built upon the work initiated by the Sustainable Data Management Cluster at ESIP. And with that context in mind, the project explores several connected questions. So the first three questions that you see on the left help us understand what happens when data systems are disrupted. So we asked and we looked at how have data disruptions affected the ability of folks to do high quality research? How have how have they affected communities responding to disasters and crises? And we also wanted to look at how has losing personnel affected data collection, curation, and sharing. The last two questions helped us to surface the strategies that were already helping real repositories prepare, respond, and recover. So we wanted to find out what strategies folks have tried already that help them to mitigate impacts from disruption, what supports are needed to strengthen resilience going forward. And so those questions helped us to look at both sides of the issue. So the project was not only about identifying the risks in the disruption, but it was also about understanding resilience in practice. Another aspect of the project was looking at how the RCS scorecards could better support reflection, planning, and action. So to answer those questions, the project brought together several forms of input. We shared and tested the Repository Crisis Scorecards, gathering feedback and ideas for improvement. We also conducted surveys and focus groups about experiences with data disruption. We then looked across the survey and focus group input for recurring themes about data disruption, its impacts, and the strategies people were already using to respond. Those conversations helped us to understand the experiences and concerns behind the disruptions people were describing. The RCS submissions gave us insight into the current landscape of repository resilience across participating repositories. Feedback on the RCS helped us revise and improve the tool itself. I'm pasting in the chat a link to the RCS as well as the white paper here. And finally, we published a white paper to share what we learned and share the strategies for strengthening repository resilience going forward. So the insights came from people with direct experience across the repository ecosystem, administrators and staff who run repositories, data users or researchers who depend on them, citizen archivists or data rescue volunteers who step in when data is at risk. And so many participants have seen firsthand what happens when repositories fail, lose capacity, or come under threat. And others were thinking ahead about how to protect the system's data and communities that they care about before crisis occurs.
So over the next 15 minutes, I'm going to focus on the findings from our focus group and survey responses, where we ask questions about how different groups have been impacted by those disruptions in data access. I'm going to be sharing several quotes directly from our project participants because we really wanted to bring these personal stories forward as much as we could with this project. So related to sharing personal stories, as I share the findings, we will leave the next poll open and available to gather your reflections on what is resonating with you as I go through these. You might share something that feels familiar, something that surprises you, or something that connects to your own work. And then after the findings are presented, we will share a word cloud that kind of highlights some of the keywords that came from that. And if you are just joining us, I'm going to provide instructions for how to participate in the poll into the chat. So ultimately, resilience is a systems property. Therefore, resilience depends less on any individual component than on how well the entire system absorbs and recovers from disruption. So the project found that repositories generally perform well during routine operations, but become vulnerable when multiple stresses occur simultaneously. So the strongest repositories are not those that avoid disruption, they are those that are designed to withstand it. So when you think of these repositories as a system, it becomes evident that a disruption rarely stays isolated, with one disruption having a cascading effect. So from our project, 56% of our focus groups and 64% of our survey respondents cited ongoing financial and operational strain as a threat. So as a system, funding reductions can result in a loss of staff. Those staff carry institutional knowledge with them, which is often difficult, if not impossible, to recover. And then once those staff are lost, your technical capacity becomes limited, which increases the fragility of your infrastructure and can result in maintenance delays. If data access is interrupted for any users, This can ultimately lead to a loss of confidence and trust in your data, and this could then feed into more funding reductions. So one specific example of how these disruptions play out comes from NOAA. So recent funding reductions led to understaffing and reduced capacity to maintain and deliver data products that support weather forecasting, hurricane prediction, atmospheric observations, and emergency management. So while the immediate effect was reduced operational capacity, the impacts extended much further. So our participants described the same pattern repeatedly. Funding disruptions rarely remain financial problems. They cascade through the workforce, technical infrastructure, and ultimately affect the people and decisions that depend on these data every day. As one participant summarized, I think funding stability is the existential threat. But not all disruptions begin with funding or staffing. Sometimes the disruption comes from outside the repository itself. Following Hurricane Helene, giving another example from NOAA, their National Centers for Environmental Information lost network connectivity for several weeks. And although the repository staff and data holdings remained intact, hundreds of incoming data streams could not be ingested. Some observations were at risk of being lost, and users could not access many of its services. So processing this backlog took months after connectivity was restored, but this example again highlights an important lesson from the project that resilience is about more than protecting data. It is also about ensuring that people can access, update, and rely on that data when it is needed the most. So all of these findings point to an extremely fragile system. The repositories many of us depend on are running with thin margins. They patch things together with volunteer labor and limited funding, but there's rarely a plan for what happens when those run out. A good analogy is a Jenga tower. So you remove just one of those pieces, whether it's a staff member, a funding source, or a supporting service, and the consequences ripple outward in ways that are hard to predict and harder to reverse. As one project participant put it, some systems are running with people on renewable 3-month contracts. So it's inherent that the system is going to fail if the critical staff are all on short-term contracts. And once these systems collapse, what was lost may be gone permanently. Sharing another participant quote, "We're going to see a loss of information that will make the burning of the Library of Alexandria look like nothing, and it's going to happen before anyone notices." So the ongoing losses of funding, staff, and the data itself have broader human and societal impacts. Repository staff and researchers were well represented in our focus groups and surveys, so I wanted to share the impacts from these two groups specifically, and we'll return to broader societal impacts near the end of the presentation. But for repository staff, many of them are burnt out by trying to keep a system running on limited resources. They have lost institutional knowledge that cannot be recovered and are left with trying to find and hire who many in our focus groups refer to as a unicorn. And I hope you all like this picture as much as I do. But these are individuals who combine scientific expertise, software engineering, data management, and user support. They spoke of these individuals as being very hard to find, but even harder to replace. So then we have researchers whose workflows are interrupted by these disruptions in data and related services. So this results in uncertainty and the inability to reproduce previous work. So several researchers we spoke to mentioned downloading data sets to their computers as a personal backup in case anything ever happened because their work is so reliant on its ongoing availability. So one of our focus group participants mentioned a research database they manage, stating there are only 2 of us who are working on it on a voluntary basis, ensuring that the service is running, responding to any queries. Along with these funding and staff realities, there is also a fear of what could be lost. So this quote was from a participant referencing digital artifacts only available in their institution's collection. But if our institution's budget goes away, if God forbid our institution closes, then all of humanity has lost access to that piece of our human prehistory, which may not exist anywhere else in the world and may not be replicable. And there is also a lot of pessimism within the community. This quote was from a participant when asked what supports, policies, or practices are most needed to improve repository resilience. In terms of policy, what can you do to prevent it? Nothing. We're completely at the point for policymakers that this is never going to be a make or break issue when it comes to elections. Nobody's going to say, but what is your position on research data repositories? But there's also a lot of optimism. As this quote states, the people behind the system know what they are doing because they've been doing it for a long time. They just need the resources to make it happen. So I'm going to pause here to examine some of the key words that have emerged to our question on what has resonated with you so far. It seems that cascading and fragility are two of the big terms that have emerged. So thank you for sharing that. It definitely, again, seems to be a pattern across all of the folks we spoke to, and as you would expect from folks that are attending the webinar today. So thank you all for sharing your responses to that question. I'm now going to transition to discuss the strategies for resilience that were shared with us. So we have grouped the strategies listed in the report into three strategic priorities for this presentation. The first strategic priority is to reduce dependence on single points of failure. This can be done by diversifying funding, having multiple staff members sharing critical knowledge with each other, creating multiple copies of all the data that is available through multiple institutions. And I want to share another quote here that highlights this point clearly. One of the big risk factors is where there are big, well-funded institutions. And I think what recent events have exposed is that even big and well-funded single points of failure are still single points of failure. But building resilience means reducing dependence on any single funder, institution, person, or technology while strengthening those connections that allow the broader repository system to adapt and recover. So a second strategic priority is to build continuity before disruption occurs. This includes making succession plans for staff transitions, having comprehensive metadata and backups that have been tested. Crisis response plans help you prepare for a crisis before it actually occurs. And documentation should describe important workflows and include detailed information on backup and recovery. As one participant shared, this year I have seen that repositories that had a succession plan have done the best. Ones who have been scrambling to put together a plan have done the worst. However, I wanted to make a note here that documentation can help mitigate the loss of staff, but it can't capture the judgment that comes from years of experience. So knowing which exception to a rule matters, how to troubleshoot a problem that was never anticipated, or even how to navigate a relationship with a partner institution that took years to build. So documentation can only go so far, and our project participants stated this repeatedly. And then a final strategic priority I want to highlight is to strengthen community rather than individual repositories. So rather than every repository solving resilience alone, resilience becomes a property of the broader system. This can be done through distributed infrastructure, crisis support agreements, international replication, shared standards, and partnerships. And so I want to share an example of this. So in 2025, a series of politically driven directives led NASA to terminate its contract with the team operating the Socioeconomic Data and Application Center, or CDAC, putting over 6 terabytes of data at risk that had bridged Earth and social science research communities. But community efforts ultimately helped relocate much of that data. But this example really highlights one current challenge for building those resilient and trusted systems. So we are going to pause here to see if anyone has any questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Feel free to unmute yourself or add your question into the chat. And we still have more presentations, so no one run away. We just wanted to have a mid presentation pause for folks if you have any questions about what we just went over. And again, we'll have some space as well at the end. I'll pause for one more minute. So Lauren asked the question, how many repositories actually have a succession plan? I have no idea, Lauren. That is a great question. I assume maybe no one has that information. I could be wrong. If anyone is aware of any data about that, please feel free to respond to Lauren in the chat. I will say from a lot of these conversations and what we heard from folks is that they want to put these plans together, but they don't have the time and capacity to do it because they're just trying to keep things running. So they kind of need a little bit of yeah, time and space to make some of those things happen because pulling those together does, it is quite the endeavor. So I will say that.
Yeah, and I also add that that's a great question, and it is now captured in the latest version of the RCS as well. So hopefully, as we see responses come in on that, and the Sustainable Data Management Cluster is taking a look at that data, we can get a sort of idea of like, based on out of the total people who have taken the RCS, how many of those have said yes to that succession plan question and crisis scenario planning question.
Yeah, Nancy commented too, it depends on what you expect to be in a succession plan. We have a continuity of operations. So thanks for sharing that, Nancy. I'm going to start sharing my screen again. Alrighty, now I'm going to transition it over to Talisha.
All right, found the unmute button. So thanks, Alicia, and thanks for the questions. Next, I'll share some information about the RCS. So the RCS is a self-assessment tool. The questions in the RCS are divided into 7 sections, A through G, that ask about the practices that shape resilience, including storage and replication, staffing and cross-training, documentation, governance, crisis planning, and more. Those answers are then used to help identify where a repository may be more or less prepared across 4 different disruption scenarios. For example, a repository that has geographically separated data replication, that may reduce the impact of a localized natural disaster. Cross-training and role coverage may reduce the impact of losing key personnel. Diverse funding sources may reduce vulnerability to funding instability, and so on. And so the RCS uses the answers to your questions to provide a report that summarizes strengths, vulnerabilities, unknowns, and priorities. In this way, the RCS helps respondents connect everyday practices to crisis readiness. It shows how the systems, people, plans, and partnerships already in place can shape a repository's ability to prepare, respond, and recover. So as part of this project, we continued testing the first version of the RCS that was developed through ESIP's Sustainable Data Management Cluster and gathered feedback from people who completed it or reviewed it. Across that feedback, we heard that the RCS was very valuable as a self-assessment tool, and it helped repositories and those that completed the RCS reflect on resilience, identify strengths, and recognize areas where more planning or conversation may be needed. We heard that the questions were complex and sometimes difficult to interpret. There were also challenges with the response options as those vary based on the context of the question. So in response to that feedback, all question wording was clarified by reframing the questions as to what extent questions, using a consistent 1.1 to 5 Likert response scale across all questions. which also helps to reduce the cognitive load of taking the assessment. To further support interpretation, supporting guidance was added. We also heard that users needed flexibility when questions did not apply. So the option to select NA was also added to the questions as well. Lastly, we heard that scores were difficult to interpret. So the scoring was updated to use a 0 to 100% scale, and reports with plain language interpretation and recommendations were added. And so the goal with these updates was to preserve the depth of the original tool while making it more user-friendly and supporting more consistent interpretation across users. And so before we walk through the updated RCS, I want to share 4 questions with you. So thinking about a repository you manage, use, support, or care about, what are the repository strengths? Could you answer the question, where is the repository most vulnerable? Or where do we need more information? Or even the question, what should we prioritize next? So you don't have to answer those questions right now, but if you had to, I wonder if the answer to any of those questions would be, I don't know. And if so, that's okay, because sometimes I don't know is the most important finding, because it points to where more conversation, documentation, or shared planning may be needed. So as we move into the demo or walkthrough, we are not just looking at the mechanics of the tool. I like to show you how it can help move from general concern or question to clear conversations about current practices, possible vulnerabilities, and next steps. So again, exit full screen. I'm going to take over the screen share here. All right. So you should be seeing the spreadsheet version of the RCS. So now I'll briefly preview the spreadsheet version of the RCS.
Can you zoom in a little bit, Talisha? Sorry.
Yes, I can.
Thanks.
There we go. All right.
Great. Thanks.
We won't go through every question. Instead, I'll focus on showing how it's organized, how you will respond, and how the results appear and support that those planning conversations. So when you enter the spreadsheet version of the RCS, when you open it up, on the Start Here tab, it includes the instructions on how to use this workbook to complete the RCS. It includes an explanation of the 1 to 5 Likert scale, and also information on where to find the calculations if you're a person that's interested in those sorts of things. Moving on to the Assessment tab. This is where you will find and answer all of the questions of the RCS. For example, this first question here in section A on data stewardship is, to what extent does the repository maintain multiple independent copies of its data stored at geographically separated facilities within the same country? And so, to the best of my knowledge, for example, let's say I think that this is partially in place, then I would respond with a 3, partially in place. And with the next question, for example, to what extent does the repository maintain at least one independent copy of its data stored at a facility located in a different country than its primary location? I don't think that we have this in place, for example, with the repository that I'm thinking about. So I'm going to answer 1, not in place. But I can use this notes evidence column to make a note, because Alicia may be the person on our team that is familiar with that. So I can say, ask Alicia about this. Using the notes column is not required, but it is a nice option on the spreadsheet version if you know there are certain factors or thoughts or questions about the answers that you are putting in here that you may want to follow up on. Going down to the first question in section B on infrastructure and staffing, this question asks, to what extent is the repository's physical infrastructure resilient against disruptions to power, cooling, or building systems? And for example, maybe this doesn't apply to the type of repository that I have. So I would then mark that as an A. And it's important to use an A only when a question truly doesn't apply, not just when we don't have the answer. If there's any uncertainty about the meaning behind a question or guidance is needed, moving over to this question guidance tab here, you will find a table with all of the questions as well as their supporting guidance on what is meant by the question, what to consider when answering the question. And then once all of the questions are answered, moving over to the final tab, the results report, is where you'll see that results report. And then I'm gonna zoom out just a little bit here, just so we can see the full section here at the top of the screen. So the report is organized in 3 sections. The first section includes an overall resilience summary. In this example, the overall resilience score is 61% out of 100%, and a narrative interpretation of what that score means is included here. You can see that that score falls within the established maturity band, which in this key here shows that most practices are in place with some gaps. Then you have the highest scoring sections with their scores are shown as strengths, and the lowest 3 scoring sections with their scores are shown as priority areas for improvement. Going down into the next section on crisis scenario readiness, the report includes, again, score, maturity band, and that narrative interpretation of preparedness for each of the 4 crisis scenarios that are included in this RCS: natural disaster, defunding, cyber attack, cybercrime, and loss of personnel. Lastly, in part 3, the report includes a similar breakdown for each of the 7 sections. So in this example, for section A, it received a score of 58%, which falls into that developing band. We see here that narrative interpretation. The report also shows how many questions were answered. So we can see that 8 out of 10 questions were answered, with 2 of those marked NA. And then that's followed by priority recommendations that are based on the 2 lowest scoring questions in that section. So it includes those as priority recommendations. And you'll find that information going down for each of the 7 sections. So this demonstrates how the RCS helps us to answer the questions. Where are we prepared? Where maybe we would be vulnerable or exposed? Those NA questions or unknown answers help us to identify where more information or conversation may be needed. And with that, we can identify and decide and make decisions on what should be prioritized next. I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you, Alicia. So in addition to the spreadsheet and XLS, downloadable XLS version of the RCS, it's also available online as a fillable form. The online form version includes 7 pages, 1 for each of the 7 sections, and you can see the formatting at the top here of the questions, followed by the guidance below that. And then once the 7 sections have been responded to, a page will appear that includes the report and the option to download that report as PDF. And the 2 mirror each other. So after completing the questions of the after completing the RCS, we encourage you to save your results, share them with colleagues or leadership, and use them as a basis for discussion. The RCS is not intended to produce a final verdict on a repository. It is intended to support structured reflection and planning. We also encourage you to revisit the RCS occasionally. Repository resilience can change over time as staffing, funding, infrastructure, and community needs change. So retaking or revisiting the RCS can help you see where progress has been made, maybe where risks have shifted, and also where new priorities may be emerging. So that brings us to our next poll. So after learning a bit more about the RCS, how would you be most likely to use it? To determine repository strengths, where it might be most vulnerable. What question do you feel right now would be your question that would drive you to, you'll be looking to find out the answer to? So we're seeing identifying those vulnerabilities and some uncertainty. Definitely a lot of identifying vulnerability. And we'll just give a few more seconds for responses. Thank you very much for entering your responses on there. All right, at least in this room today, it seems like our breakdown is really heavily leaning toward identifying vulnerability, and then some uncertainty or other ideas as far as using the RCS to maybe start some conversations and some planning around how you can support repository resilience. So that's awesome. All right. And with that, I'll now pass it back to Alicia to share more about moving from findings to action.
So as we start thinking about our findings and how we can act on them, it's helpful to pause and define what we mean by resilience. So in the context of this project, we defined repository resilience as the ability to make data accessible, recoverable, and useful under both normal and crisis conditions. So a resilient repository is not one that avoids every disruption. Disruptions can come from many directions, and no repository can control all of them. Instead, resilience is about how well a repository can anticipate disruption, distribute risk, share responsibility, learn from failure, and recover quickly. That means asking questions like, have we thought ahead about what could go wrong? Are risks distributed across systems, people, and partnerships? Is responsibility shared, or does too much depend on one person, one funder, one tool, or one location? Do we learn from disruptions and near misses? And can we recover access, communication, and operations when something does happen? So this is why resilience is not only a technical condition, it is shaped by processes, staffing, documentation, and the broader system around the repository. So a major takeaway from this project is that repository resilience depends not only on what repositories do internally, but also on whether society values repositories as essential infrastructure. So repositories are often most visible when something goes wrong. So when data are missing, inaccessible, at risk, or urgently needed, but resilience requires support before that happens. So as we note in the white paper, long-term repository resilience depends on treating data repositories as public infrastructure, worthy of sustained investment despite limited understanding of data stewardship among many decision makers. So that point is important because the work of resilience is often quiet and ongoing. It includes maintaining systems, documenting workflows, training staff, building relationships, and planning for transitions. And those activities may not always look urgent, but they are what makes recovery possible when those disruptions happen. So when we talk about repository resilience, we are also talking about whether the people, systems, relationships, and planning required to keep data available over time are properly valued and supported. Back to you, Talisha.
Thank you. All right, so one of the things we want to emphasize is that repository resilience is not only the responsibility of repository administrators. We can all support resilience in different ways. Sharing one action, for example, repository administrators can identify one area where documentation needs to be improved. or technical staff might review a backup or recovery process. Data users or researchers can help by citing and acknowledging repositories when using data, and citizen archivists or community contributors might help by documenting local knowledge. Lastly, an action that funders or policymakers might take could be recognizing repositories as critical infrastructure. The larger message is that everyone has a role, and repository resilience is strengthened when the work of preserving, maintaining, funding, and advocating for data is shared across the ecosystem. As we close this section and move into our final Q&A, I want to come back to the larger message. Repository resilience is not built through one tool, one report, or one webinar. It's built over time through ongoing reflection, shared responsibility, practical planning, and sustained support. So that means taking time to assess what matters most, documenting and strengthening what we can, investing in the people and infrastructure that keep data available, and recognizing that everyone connected to repositories has a role to play. The RCS is one tool to support that work, but the larger value comes from the conversations, decisions, and actions that follow. And that goes along the lines of the comment made by Lauren in the chat as well, speaks to that. So with that, it looks like we have time for questions. That concludes our presentation on the project, our findings, well, a summary of some of the findings. You will find the findings related to the RCS submissions and in the white paper. We weren't able to include those in the presentation today, but those are in the white paper. Yeah, and then we did the walkthrough of the RCS and we share some other takeaways. And so if there are any questions or thoughts, feel free to unmute or add them into the chat. So we have a conversation going on in the chat about patterns in responses or reactions after taking the RCS.
Go ahead, Lauren.
So first of all, just thank you so much for all the work on this. It's an amazing project, and you've clearly done like so much background in this, and I really can see how it'll be so useful. One of the things that I've heard about other sort of evaluation frameworks like this, like the principles of open scholarly infrastructure, POSI, or chaos metrics, and these other kind of frameworks like this, is that people wind up seeing them almost aspirationally. Like they fill out the scorecard not just to like assess where they are right now, but to kind of get an idea of okay, where are we, are we missing something? And we need to like focus on an area. Is this a plan that we can develop for our future going forward? I was wondering, as you were designing this, did you have that sort of aspirational outcome in mind for the people actually filling out the scorecard, or how were you thinking about how people would actually use it?
That's a great question. So summarizing the question a little bit, it's like as we're developing the RCS, what thoughts do we have in mind related to how people will use it? There's an idea that you could fill it out considering what your best practices currently are. But as you mentioned, a lot of times when folks take these sorts of assessments, they fill it out sort of aspirationally, like this is where, this is what I wish we were doing at the time. And since this work started with with the Sustainable Data Management Cluster, which is a volunteer group through ESIP. And then we were building on that work with one of their group members. The goal was to find out, with the tool that was already developed, how we could improve it in the way that it was. And that actually did come up. And so if you might have saw at the top in the instructions of the RCS, when I on the spreadsheet version, it says to fill it out with what your best practices currently are, and many of us being scientists or in research or in a similar realm may know, you can fill it out aspirationally. Your response that you get in that report is going to show you what resilience would be when you are there, but it's not going to give you the answer of where you are right now. And so, it really depends on what someone is trying to evaluate. And, hopefully the instructions and reminders and guidance of, please fill it out with your best practices and not what you aspire to be, will help folks to, make those responses a little bit closer to where they are right now, and be able to utilize that to spearhead conversations with their teams and with their community about what priorities they want to carry forward.
I'll also add the Sustainable Data Management Cluster at ESIP that developed the first version of the RCS and provided some guidance for the second version. They're also currently in the process of kind of writing up their process for developing the RCS, that first version, and what their thought process was, and even considering some of the other tools out there. So we'll definitely be sharing that back out with the community when it becomes available. So that's really great. And then I wanted to comment a little bit on what Michael put into the chat about international partnerships. I will say we heard from a lot of people that they've tried to share data with another country, but if those data policies are different in that country from what your data policies are, it's not as simple as just passing it over to another location. So there are a lot of complexities with sharing data in that way. And again, I think it's, another thing that links back to the importance of us having these ongoing conversations to try to support each other in the best ways that we can. And feel free, Michael, if you want to unmute yourself and add anything to that. I don't want to speak for you.
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. We're funded to take on a certain amount of data and do work on that data, and it's really hard to push beyond those means. And so maybe using a scorecard like this to say, hey, we can go from the 60 to 80% to the 80 to 90% and be more resilient and things like that. At the end of the day, you have to sell why that's important, not just that we can do it. But yeah, it's a challenge. But at least what isn't happening, kind of what you're saying. You're able to explore this area of where maybe you're falling short of what perfection is, and you can at least start having those conversations, thinking about it, even if the time scale is years, maybe longer, and hopefully you hit those goals before one of these crises happen for us.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. There's been a couple more comments and stuff added to the chat. But yeah, we'll continue to go ahead, Kelly.
Thanks. All of this is so interesting. I think it's the people on this call, I think, all realize how critically important all of this is. And I think anybody who's in research or science or doing this kind of work does. But I think to many people, it sounds kind of dry, right? Like, oh, data repositories, I don't know.
Did you not like our presentation, Kelly?
No, no, not. But what I mean is, how do you think we can get people, especially decision makers who might not be steeped in this work, to see the urgency of this. I was really struck by that comment about the burning down of the Library of Alexandria, because I mean that is kind of that is the scale of things. I heard something once about like so much of the internet, so much of what had been on the internet prior is already gone. Like just not data sets in general, but what, the internet itself. And so I think it's worthwhile to think about how can we bring this message to people who may not be thinking about it and who may not realize the importance of it.
Yeah, I think those are really great comments, Kelly, because again, a big message we heard across everyone was that the way to fix this problem is that society has to understand the value of it. Again, it needs to be funded in the way public info, like our roads are funded, our electrical grids are funded, all of those things. And so, a lot of the data that's feeding a lot of people use day to day, it's not visible. They don't know what's happening behind the scenes and what could happen if all of those things break. I'm assuming someone who's not myself is in positions that messaging can get out in the world. Hopefully some of those things are happening, but I don't know if anyone else on the call has been involved in some of those conversations and would like to share anything about any of that. I think if it's not happening, we probably need to start thinking about how to start making it happen. Like I said, everyone was kind of like things are just about to just crumble. Um, so
I wonder if some of the work that AGU is doing around gathering folks together in this conversation around this conversation will help to get some of those things started. That seems like a really large, internationally reaching, project and conversation going on about, this topic. So hopefully continuing to shed light and trying to share data and information and digestible, chunks for folks will eventually reach the people that we hope it will reach. And so, yeah.
yeah, if there's anyone on the call that has a link to that effort that AGU was working on, please do share that in the chat. I know there's kind of a lot of movement around that, but if folks are interested in being engaged more in that conversation. But I am going to kind of share our closing and then, we can stay on for a little bit longer if folks have any additional questions or comments that they would like to add. But we did want you all just to take a little bit of time to respond to one final question about what is one action you will take in the next 6 months to improve repository resilience. Again, even thinking about Kelly's comment, like how can we take what we're learning, what we're hearing from everyone and actually like making change or doing something about it. But this could be something formal. You could complete the RCS with your team. It could be something relational, like starting a conversation with colleagues, leadership. It could also be something practical, like documenting a workflow. But, feel free to add your responses here. And as you're adding those, I'll go to kind of our closing slide, and then I'll go back to some of the responses that you all have put in there. But we did want to thank all of you for joining us today. Thank the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation again for the funding that supported this project, as well as our partners ESIP and Tessera Strategies. All of the products from the project can be found on the project website. I will add that link again into the chat, and I know that Talisha has shared it, but you can also send any questions to us at rcs@esipfed.org. And ESIP's Sustainable Data Management Cluster plans to continue to steward this work So you are invited to join that group. It is open to anyone with interest. I'm adding a link into the chat to join their mailing list. And so basically you'll just receive communications about upcoming meetings and things that they might be discussing. And as I mentioned before, if you do want access to any of the slides that we shared today, I'm going to add that DOI again here. So you have it. And then I'm going to go back to see some of the things folks have added into their next steps. So great. Well, we'll stay on for a little bit longer. We'll continue to share what folks are entering into the poll with actions that you're going to take. Hopefully they'll be inspirational for folks to move some ideas forward. So, but again, thank you all so much for joining us. And please let us know if you have any questions. We'll be here for a few more minutes.